Somewhere beneath a lake that 15 million people visit every single year, there is a forest. Not driftwood, not scattered branches. An entire forest, standing upright, rooted exactly where it grew. Nobody put it there, and nobody knocked it down. The water simply rose around it so slowly that not a single tree ever fell. That forest has stood at the bottom of Lake Tahoe for roughly 7,000 years. Almost no one alive knew it existed. Its trunks rise into total darkness, the way they once rose into mountain sunlight. This is not the story you have heard about this lake. The story you have heard is about bodies. This one is stranger, and it is real. For more than a century, two competing legends have circled this lake. Both share the same shape. Something is down there that the world was never meant to see. The first legend says the lake has no bottom. Somewhere near the center, the rock falls away into a shaft nobody has ever measured. Some versions connect it to distant rivers, other lakes, even the ocean itself. Whatever sinks in never comes back up. The second legend is darker and far more specific. It says the coldest, deepest water preserves bodies like a natural vault. Men who crossed the wrong people during the casino era were weighted down and dropped into that black water. They're still there today, standing upright in the dark. For 100 years, nobody could prove either legend wrong. There was a simple reason. No one could actually see the bottom to check. Before we talk about what a machine finally found, you need to understand the lake itself, because the real geology and physics of Tahoe are almost as staggering as the folklore, and they are exactly what kept those stories alive for so long. Both stories have been told at Tahoe's bars and campfires for generations. Most people who visit have heard at least one of them. That is how legends survive, not from any single witness, but from endless retelling. Lake Tahoe sits more than 6,000 feet up in the Sierra Nevada, right on the border between California and Nevada. The basin was not carved by a river, it was created by block faulting, the force that pulls the wider basin and range apart. Whole blocks of land drop down along fault lines to form long, steep-walled valleys. Between 2 and 3 million years ago, a section of the Sierra dropped along exactly this kind of fault. Rain and snowmelt filled the scar. Later, glaciers deepened the basin and left behind the granite boulders and sandy margins you see at the shore today. The scale of what that process built is hard to hold in your head. At its deepest confirmed point, the floor sits 1,145 feet below the surface. The Empire State Building stands 1,154 feet tall. Drop the whole building into Tahoe, and its roof would still sit nearly 200 feet underwater. Even the Eiffel Tower would not reach 2/3 of the way down. The lake holds an estimated 39 trillion gallons of water. Spread it evenly across the entire state of California, and it would cover the whole state more than a foot deep. And Tahoe is almost impossibly clear. It is low in the nutrients and algae that cloud most large lakes. On a calm morning, you can pick out individual pebbles on the bottom. Conservation agencies on both sides of the border have spent decades protecting that clarity, even as it has slowly declined since researchers began tracking it in the 1960s. Here is the contradiction that grows legends. You can see forever near the surface. You can see nothing at all a few hundred feet down. Below about 700 feet, sunlight disappears completely, not dimmed, gone. The darkness is cold, too, and permanently so. Below about 300 feet, the water settles at roughly 39 degrees Fahrenheit, the exact point where fresh water reaches its maximum density and sinks. It refuses to mix with the warmer layers above. Only something violent can stir the whole lake from the surface. So picture it. A lake clear enough to feel like a swimming pool, sitting on a basin deep enough to swallow a skyscraper. Sunlight on top, blackness below. And for more than a century, nobody had ever checked what sat in that blackness. That cold, still water did one more thing. It gave the darkest legend a scientific sounding foundation. And that part is not entirely fiction. Warm, oxygen-rich water is a busy place for bacteria. A wooden boat can rot away within a decade. A body can decompose within days. Cold, still water is the opposite. The bacteria that drive decay slow down dramatically, sometimes to near inactivity. Under the right cold, low oxygen conditions, body fat can go through a real, documented process called saponification. It converts into a waxy, soap-like substance that can leave a person's features recognizable for years, even decades. This is genuine biology, documented in cold lakes elsewhere in the world. It is the real seed that Tahoe's legend grew from. So take the ingredients, real depth, real cold, real preservation chemistry, then stretch them with storytellers into a gallery of standing corpses that nobody has ever actually verified. The history made the story easy to believe, too. The Cal Neva Lodge sat directly on the California-Nevada state line on Tahoe's north shore, with the border literally painted across its showroom floor. Through the late 1950s and early 60s, it was a genuine hub of organized crime-adjacent activity. Nevada regulators revoked Frank Sinatra's gaming license there in 1963, following reported visits from a senior Chicago crime figure. The atmosphere was real. And the leap from that atmosphere to bodies in the lake did not take much imagination. But here is something worth being honest about. No verified human remains connected to organized crime have ever been recovered from Tahoe's deep basin. That absence of evidence does not prove nothing is down there. It is a detail the legend has always conveniently skipped. Around the same years those legends were hardening, Tahoe was becoming something new. The years after the war brought resorts, cabins, and casinos racing up the shoreline. More people meant more boats, more debris, and more stories. The lake was busier than it had ever been, and its depths were more untouchable than ever. Still, no single story did more for Tahoe's reputation than one supposed sentence, attached to one of the most famous names in underwater exploration. According to the legend, sometime in the 1970s, Jacques Cousteau came to Lake Tahoe with a submersible. Cousteau was the man who co-invented the aqualung. He brought the ocean into living rooms across the world through his television specials. He descended alone into the near-freezing dark. And when he came back up, the story says he was pale, quiet, and shaken. Someone asked what he had seen. He supposedly answered, "The world is not ready for what is down there." Sit with that sentence for a moment because it was built almost perfectly for spreading. It describes no single thing. It implies everything and confirms nothing. So every listener fills in the blank with whatever frightens them most. Here is the honest correction. That quote has no verifiable source at all. No recording, no interview transcript, no article where those words can be traced back to him. It travels from retelling to retelling, gaining drama with every pass, and it lands nowhere solid. More importantly, there is no confirmed record that Cousteau ever dived in Lake Tahoe in the first place. The organization that keeps the official archive of his expeditions has no Tahoe dive in his documented career. Members of his own family have spent years quietly pushing back on the story. So think about that. The single most famous piece of evidence for something horrifying in this lake is a sentence that was almost certainly never spoken by the man credited with it. Which raises an obvious question. Why did it take over a century for anyone to actually check? Because for almost all of Tahoe's human history, reaching the bottom simply was not survivable. The Washoe people lived along these shores for at least 9,000 years before European contact. They fished the shallows and left the deep basin alone. They understood the deep water as something to respect, not enter. That was spiritual tradition. It was also sound physical judgment. Here is what that judgment was protecting them from. Recreational scuba becomes seriously dangerous well before 130 feet. That is where nitrogen narcosis begins to cloud thinking. Divers compare it to alcohol intoxication. It arrives quietly, and it dulls judgment at exactly the moment judgment matters most. Push past 200 feet, and the risks pile up fast. Oxygen toxicity, decompression complications, the mechanical challenge of managing gas mixtures in bitter cold. Elite technical divers using mixed gas have pushed dives in Tahoe past 800 feet, and every added foot narrows the margin for error. Tahoe adds one more problem most divers never have to face. At more than 6,000 feet of elevation, the air pressure at the surface is meaningfully lower than at sea level. That means every standard decompression table has to be adjusted for altitude before it is even safe to use. So add it up. Depth, cold, altitude. Together they make this one of the most self-protecting bodies of water on the continent. The bottom stayed hidden, not because nobody was curious. Curiosity alone could not survive down there. Over the decades, a handful of specialized teams did push deeper anyway. Using mixed gas rebreather systems built for cave and wreck diving, they went past 600 feet, then past 700. Even these veterans called Tahoe uniquely punishing, because altitude, cold, and depth all compound each other at once instead of showing up as separate, manageable problems. A few of those dives caught brief glimpses of something strange, upright shapes at the edge of their lights, hard returns on sonar. But without proper lighting, positioning, and mapping, nobody could document what they had seen. It took a different kind of tool to turn scattered whispers into a real data discovery. That tool was a tethered machine, not a braver diver. An ROV, a remotely operated vehicle, carries lights, cameras, and sensors down into conditions that would kill a human in minutes. The operator sits warm and dry on a boat above, watching everything on a monitor. The machine goes where diving physiology simply cannot follow. But before the robot could find anything, someone had to map the floor. That job went to multi-beam sonar. The machine fires a fan of sound pulses downward and times how long each echo takes to bounce back. Thousands of tiny measurements build into a three-dimensional map of the lake bed, accurate to within centimeters, made without a single human eye ever looking at the bottom directly. Surveyors call the process mowing the lawn. Run enough overlapping passes across the basin, and the points grow into a complete chart of the entire floor. That is exactly what the United States Geological Survey did. Their maps became the most detailed charts in the lake's history. The maps also closed one legend for good. They confirmed the maximum depth at 1,645 feet, right there in the scientific record. The bottomless lake was now a dead story, even if it lingered a little longer in the popular imagination. But sonar gives you a map, not a picture. That is where the ROV comes in. Think about what the descent looks like, because it has its own rhythm. In the first 30 feet, the water is so clear that the robot casts a sharp shadow on the bottom. Operators can pick out individual pebbles. By 100 feet, the golden sunlight is thinned into a faint suggestion. By 200 feet, the warm end of the color spectrum is gone. Red, orange, yellow, all absorbed by the water. Everything renders in muted blue and green. By 300 feet, even those cooler tones fade to nothing. The robot's own lights are doing all the work now. A narrow cone of white cutting into water the color of late dusk. And beyond the edge of that cone, there is nothing. Not a shadow, not a suggestion, nothing. Darkness taller than a skyscraper stacked on darkness, all the way down. And it was right around that depth, in the gloom between the last traces of sunlight and total blackness, that the survey recorded something nobody had been looking for. The sonar returns changed first. Hard, clustered echoes where the sediment should have been flat and featureless. The chart showed a field of small, sharp returns rising out of the mud, like whiskers on an otherwise empty screen. Then the robot's lights settled on them, and the shapes resolved into trees. Not driftwood, not scattered branches, trunks of real substance, some bare, some still carrying skeletal branches reaching up into black water. The spacing was the giveaway. These trees stood the way trees space themselves when they grow from seed and compete naturally for light. Each one holds its own patch of ground. This was not the chaotic tangle of storm-felled timber. It was an intact, undisturbed landscape. There is something specifically unsettling about a tree still standing at the bottom of a lake. A fallen log is debris. A rooted vertical tree is something else entirely. It is a landscape that was never destroyed, only slowly, gently drowned. Imagine being the operator on that boat when the lights first found them. You have spent hours staring at mud and rock. Suddenly, the screen fills with what looks like a forest floor at night. Only it is 600 feet of water above you, and the forest has been there longer than anyone alive has even remembered it. When wood samples were finally brought up and submitted for radiocarbon dating, the results were remarkable. Radiocarbon dating works by measuring the decay of carbon inside once living things. Every plant collects it while it is alive. The clock starts the moment it dies. Read that clock on Tahoe's wood, and it says these trees are roughly 6,000 to 7,000 years old. Let that number sink in. These trees were alive and growing in open Sierra sunlight before the first Egyptian dynasties had even begun to take shape. They have now sat underwater longer than any structure we would recognize as civilization has existed in the Western Hemisphere. It is a strange feeling looking at something that old. These are not fossils. This is wood. This is what trees actually look like. You could almost reach out and touch bark that last felt wind 7,000 years ago. And for a forest to grow at that exact spot, the lake surface had to stand hundreds of feet lower than it does today. The 300-foot mark, right where these trees now stand, was almost certainly dry, sunlit ground during a period of sustained, dramatic drought thousands of years ago. That kind of low water does not happen in a bad year or two. Researchers studying the broader Sierra Nevada and Great Basin have documented evidence of prolonged, centuries-long megadroughts during the mid-Holocene period, the same window these trees date to. Droughts severe enough to drop water levels across entire lake systems in the American West. And Tahoe was not alone. Similar submerged forests and standing stumps have since been documented in other western lakes, all pointing to periods of extreme low water. That gives researchers independent evidence that this was not a one-off local event. It was part of a much larger, climate-driven pattern stretching across the region thousands of years ago. Here is the thing about a mega drought. It is not a hot summer. It is a change so slow that people living through it might not notice for generations. Lakes shrink year by year. Shorelines creep outward. And forests march out onto the new, dry ground, one seedling at a time. What makes Tahoe's version so remarkable is how well it survived. Most exposed lakebed features from that era were eventually scoured away by wave action, ice, and simple decay. Tahoe's forest survived because the water came back gently, and because the cold, low oxygen depths preserved the wood instead of destroying it. A rare, physically intact time capsule. That is how the story of a drowned forest usually goes. A rise in water, a stand of trees killed at the root line, a slow collapse of trunks and branches into the mud. Every documented drowned forest in the world carries that signature. What the robot found does not fit the picture. But that was not even the strangest part, because think about what the tree's posture tells us about how the water returned. A sudden, violent flood would have toppled this forest instantly. Trunks would lie scattered in horizontal chaos across the lakebed. That is not what the survey found. The trees were still vertical, still rooted, still spaced exactly the way a living forest spaces itself. Whatever caused the lake to rise back over this ancient dry ground did it slowly enough that the forest simply stopped living and stayed precisely where it had always stood, never knocked down, only submerged. The survey could document that result in exact, measurable detail. It could not explain the cause. That answer sits somewhere in the deeper post-glacial hydrological history of the Sierra Nevada, and researchers are still working to fully reconstruct it. So there it was, hundreds of feet down. A drowned forest, older than the pyramids, standing at attention in the dark, exactly where the legends promised horror. But the machine was not done. It moved on and kept laying its grid lines across the floor. So how does a lake drop hundreds of feet, drown a forest while leaving it standing, and then fill back up without destroying what it covered? The answers reach back to a climate that none of us have ever seen. They also raise questions about the one we are living in now. Start with the mid-Holocene, the period between roughly 8,000 and 4,000 years ago. The American West was not kind to its lakes then. Long, brutal megadroughts gripped the region, some lasting centuries. Not dry years, dry lifetimes. Water levels fell across the whole region. Shores retreated far from today's lines. And where the water pulled back, new land appeared. Grass moved in, then shrubs, then trees. Generations of forest grew on ground that had recently been lakebed. Tahoe's trees are witnesses to that world. Then the wet returned. Slowly, century by century, precipitation crept back up. The lake began to climb, and a forest cannot outrun a rising lake. Trees stand where their roots are. The water came over the root lines, and the trees drowned where they stood. Here is where the real strangeness lives. If a flood had done this, the forest would look like a battlefield. Trunks snapped, toppled, tangled in heaps. Instead, the trees look like a forest that simply stopped being alive and never fell over. That posture is the clue, and it points somewhere almost gentle. Researchers who study drowned forests say the water must have come up inches at a time, year after year, fast enough to kill trees by drowning their roots, slow enough that not one trunk lost its footing. Water rising at the pace of a few inches per decade could do exactly what the robot found. Then the cold sealed the deal. At that depth, Tahoe's water sits barely above freezing, year-round, and it barely moves. Wood does not rot the way it does in warm, busy lakes. It waits. That is why Tahoe kept an entire grove intact. Other places that dried out in the same era only kept stumps. Scientists who study the lake also point out that the deep water is not as dead as it looks. On rare occasions, deep mixing events carry oxygen all the way down. Yet even those events leave the settled floor mostly undisturbed. The wood stays, the trash stays, everything stays. So the forest answers its own questions. Where did the trees come from? Plain, dry ground. When did they die? Around 7,000 years ago. Why are they still standing? Because the water came slowly and the cold held them. But every answer raises a new question, and this one is aimed at us. If drought could drop Tahoe hundreds of feet during the mid-Holocene, what does that mean for the West today? Researchers who study past climate point out that those dry episodes were longer and more severe than almost anything we have measured in modern times. And the region is already watching its reservoirs, its snowpack, and its forests respond to a warming era. That question could fill its own documentary, and someday it will. But the robot was not finished with this lake. It moved on from the forest and kept to its patient grid, 400 feet, 500, past 600, deeper than any dive had ever properly documented, deeper than the darkest version of the legend said the bodies were waiting. And there, on an otherwise uniform stretch of silt, the sonar returns changed again, a scatter of hard, distinct echoes clustered together in one spot. A cluster like that is not automatically a story. It could be rock. It could be almost anything. But given a century of folklore about exactly this depth, nobody on that boat needed to say out loud what they were hoping or dreading the cameras would reveal. The lights finally settled on the cluster, and what they revealed was almost deflating in how ordinary it was. Not a body. Not 9 bodies arranged in some deliberate pattern. Not a man in a decades-old suit, preserved perfectly, his face intact. Bottles, aluminum cans, fishing line fused by decades of cold and pressure into a single compressed mass. A tire, the rusted corner of something no longer identifiable. Ordinary trash, 600 feet down, in one of the most heavily protected lakes on the continent. The survey had aimed its lights at the exact spot the darkest legend pointed to. It found the accumulated carelessness of 1,000 ordinary summer afternoons. 100 years of the darkest storytelling in the Sierras, and the cameras answered with the contents of a lost afternoon. It is almost funny, in a grim way. The lake that was supposed to hide the unthinkable was hiding a cooler and a spare tire, and that pattern held across the entire survey, not just at that one site. In the shallows, in the mid-depth margins, all the way down into the permanent cold and dark. The cameras documented a consistent scatter of glass, aluminum, plastic, and sunken equipment. much of it dating back to the mid-20th century when protections were minimal and the shoreline was being developed fast. It is not as if Tahoe lacked protection during that time. The League to Save Lake Tahoe was founded in 1957, specifically to defend the lake's clarity and ecosystem from unchecked development. That group helped push for the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency in 1969, a bi-state compact between California and Nevada with genuinely unusual authority to regulate construction across the whole basin. Those efforts measurably slowed the lake's famous decline in clarity in the decades since, but regulation on the shore could do very little about what had already settled into the cold and dark long before anyone was watching closely. And the same stillness that preserved the ancient wood preserved the litter, bottles and cans sitting essentially unchanged for 50 or 60 years. The same cold water the legends promised would keep gangsters in pristine suits had spent all that time quietly keeping trash pristine instead. There is something that lands harder than a monster in that fact. A floor scattered with bottles and tires is not a horror story. It is a mirror. It shows exactly what generations of ordinary people, standing on ordinary decks on ordinary afternoons, chose to let sink in a place they assumed was beyond anyone's notice or accountability. A lake bottom is a kind of archive. Whatever sinks, stays. Read that archive and you get a history of the 20th century written in glass and aluminum. Every era of the shore is down there, filed away in the silt. And here's the quiet turnaround. The same maps that finally settled the legends are now guiding the cleanup. Conservation organizations send ROVs and technical divers back down with a new mission. Not chasing ghosts, hauling up bottles, anchors, tires, and engine parts from a lake bed that millions of visitors littered without ever imagining someone would go down and check. Every haul is a small piece of the lake given back. And every haul is also proof of the deeper truth the survey uncovered. The bottom of Tahoe was never a vault of secrets. It was a record. And once you learn to read it, it tells you far more truth than any legend ever did. So let's take stock, legend by legend. The lake is not bottomless. Its floor is now mapped in more precise detail than most city blocks above the surface. The shaft that supposedly swallowed everything into the earth is not there. The bodies were never there. Not the mob victims. Not any gallery of undisturbed corpses standing at attention in the dark. The cold water preservation effect is completely real, but it never produced what the legend claimed. It preserved something else. The famous warning was, in all likelihood, never spoken by the man credited with it. The legendary sentence was the invention of a story that needed a witness, and the drowned forest is real. Genuinely and verifiably strange, in a way no campfire story ever needed to invent. A landscape that lived under open sky 7,000 years ago and simply disappeared beneath rising water without ever falling down. Sit with why that distinction matters, because it is the whole point of this story. A legend about standing corpses asks you to be afraid of the lake itself, as if the water were hiding something actively malicious, something waiting. That fear points away from us. What the survey found asks something quieter, and in its own way, harder to look away from. The real story of Tahoe's depths was never about what the lake did to us. It was about what we did to the lake, one ordinary afternoon at a time. And it was about what an ancient climate did to this landscape long before any of us were here to witness it. Neither of those truths needed exaggeration to be worth telling. They just needed someone patient and equipped to finally go down and look properly. Think about what changed, because they did. The lake is no longer a mystery that invites fear. It is a place we can see, measure, and understand. The forest is no longer a rumor. It is a dated, documented piece of our own deep past. And the litter is no longer invisible. It is on a chart, waiting to be brought up. Knowing changes things. It is the difference between a dark guess and a map. Before the survey, the bottom of Tahoe could be anything, and the imagination filled it with the worst thing it could find. After the survey, it is just a place. A strange, ancient, complicated place, but a place. There is something strange and almost tender about all of it. In the permanent cold and dark, the lake holds ancient wood with the same care it holds a bottle from the 1960s. Everything that sank there, old or new, beautiful or careless, is still exactly where it landed. That is the real message of the bottom of Lake Tahoe. Things do not vanish. They wait. The trash did not disappear. It stayed exactly where it was dropped. And for the first time in the lake's long history, we finally know precisely where to look. Thank you for staying with us all the way down. Before you go, answer us this in the comments. Which one surprised you more? The forest that drowned standing up, or the pile of ordinary trash sitting exactly where the bodies were supposed to be? Tell us in one sentence. We read every single one.